The gavel didn't just bang. It sounded like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. Judge Lawrence Ellington leaned over the mahogany bench, his face twisted into a sneer that had sent hundreds of young black men to prison without a second thought. He looked at the defendant, Martin Davies, a man standing alone, silent, and seemingly helpless. Ellington thought he was looking at another statistic, another easy conviction to boost his re-election numbers. He thought he was forcing a thug to plead guilty. He was wrong. He wasn't looking at a criminal. He was looking at Special Agent Martin Thorne of the FBI, and the recording device in Martin's pocket was rolling. What happened next wasn't a trial. It was a takedown that would shake the entire judicial system. The air conditioning in courtroom 4B of the bespoke Jefferson County Courthouse was broken, leaving the air thick, stagnant, and smelling faintly of floor wax and anxious sweat. It was a humid Tuesday in July, the kind of heat that made tempers short and patience non-existent. For Judge Lawrence Ellington, however, the heat was just another tool. He liked it when the defendants were sweating. It made them desperate. It made them want to get the hell out of his sight. Judge Ellington was a fixture in Jefferson County. At 62, with silver hair slicked back and a face that looked like it was carved from granite, he projected the image of absolute authority. But locals knew the truth. They whispered it in barber shops and church parking lots. If you were white and wealthy, Ellington was a grandfatherly figure who believed in second chances. If you were black or poor, Ellington was the executioner. Docket number 4492. The bailiff, Officer Reynolds, droned out, looking bored. State versus Martin Davies. Charges: aggravated assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct. Martin Davies stepped forward. To the casual observer, he fit the profile Ellington despised. He wore a faded grey hoodie, despite the heat, and loose-fitting jeans. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a stoic expression. He didn't look down at the floor. He looked straight ahead, his eyes locked on the judge. Standing next to him was his court-appointed attorney, a nervous, sweating man named Andrew Polson. Polson was known as a plea machine. He hadn't taken a case to trial in 5 years. He existed to grease the wheels of Ellington's conviction mill. "Mr. Davies," Judge Ellington's voice boomed, amplified by the microphone. He didn't look at the file. He looked at Martin with a mixture of boredom and disdain. "You are charged with assaulting a police officer, a serious offense in my county. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Martin said. His voice was deep, calm, and surprisingly articulate. It lacked the tremor of fear Ellington was used to hearing. Ellington blinked. He adjusted his glasses, finally looking down at the paperwork. "Not guilty? The report says you shoved Officer Higgins during a traffic stop. You resisted restraints. You think Officer Higgins, a decorated veteran of the force, is lying?" "I cannot speak to Officer Higgins's motivation, Your Honor," Martin replied smoothly. "I can only speak to the facts. I did not touch him." Ellington's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking. "Let me tell you something, Mr. Davies. I don't like waste. I don't like wasting the taxpayers' money on frivolous trials for clear-cut cases. You have a public defender. That means the public is paying for your defense. You want to drag this out?" Andrew Polson cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor, my client insists on—" "Quiet, Polson," Ellington snapped. He turned his gaze back to Martin. "I see you have no prior record in this state. Maybe you think that entitles you to a break. It doesn't. It just tells me you haven't been caught yet." A ripple of uneasy silence went through the gallery. This was standard Ellington behavior, presumption of guilt before the trial even started. "I am setting bail at $50,000, Ellington announced, banging the gavel once. Polson gasped. 50,000. Your Honor, that's exorbitant. The charge is a scuffle. My client works as a mechanic. He can't afford—" "Then perhaps he shouldn't have attacked a police officer." Ellington cut him off with a cruel smile. "Bail stands. Clerk, move to the next. I request a bail hearing," Martin said, his voice cutting through the noise. The courtroom froze. Defendants didn't interrupt Judge Ellington. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Ellington slowly turned his head back to Martin. His face reddened, the heat of the room seemingly rushing to his head. "Excuse me. I have a right to a reasonable bail under the Eighth Amendment," Martin said, his posture perfect. $50,000 for a first-time offense with no flight risk is punitive, not preventative. I request an immediate review." Ellington stared at him. For a second, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. This defendant didn't sound like a mechanic, he sounded like a law student. But Ellington's arrogance quickly crushed the doubt. He was the king of courtroom 4B. "You want a hearing?" Ellington hissed. "Fine. We'll do it in my chambers. Now, recess for 15 minutes. He stood up, his black robes billowing. "Bailiff, bring the defendant back. Poulsen, get in here." As Martin was led away by the bailiff, he kept his head up. Nobody noticed that as he walked, he tapped his left index finger against his thigh in a rhythmic pattern. It was a signal. And in the back of the courtroom, a woman in a business suit, pretending to read a magazine, tapped her phone once. The trap was set. Judge Ellington's chambers were a stark contrast to the courtroom. The air conditioning here worked perfectly. The room smelled of expensive cigars and old leather. The walls were lined with awards, photos of Ellington shaking hands with governors and mayors, and a large framed antique map of the county. Ellington sat behind his massive oak desk, loosening his tie. He didn't invite Martin or Poulsen to sit. Martin stood by the door, handcuffed now, with Officer Reynolds standing guard. Poulsen stood in the middle of the room, wringing his hands. "You have an attitude problem, boy," Ellington said, dropping the legal formalities. He picked up a crystal tumbler and poured himself a glass of water, not offering any to the men standing. "I am merely exercising my rights," Martin said. "Rights?" Ellington laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You're in my house. You have the rights I give you. Now look, I'm going to make this simple because I want to go to lunch. Poulsen, tell your client the deal." Poulsen turned to Martin, his eyes pleading. "Martin, please. The judge is offering a diversion program. If you plead guilty to the assault, you do 6 months in county, then 3 years probation. It's a good deal. If you go to trial, Ellington interrupted, leaning over the desk, "I will make sure the jury sees you for exactly what you are. I will allow every piece of character evidence the prosecution wants. And when you are found guilty, and you will be, I will sentence you to the maximum. 10 years, for a traffic stop." Martin looked at the judge. "So, you're threatening me? Plead guilty to a crime I didn't commit, or you'll ruin my life?" "I'm giving you a choice," Ellington said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "We know how this goes. A man like you, against a badge? The jury loves a badge. They fear you. I'm the only thing standing between you and a decade in a cage. You think you're smart? You think quoting the Eighth Amendment scares me? I am the law in this county." "You're the law?" Martin asked, his expression unreadable. "What about justice?" Ellington scoffed. "Justice is order. Justice is keeping the streets clean of people who don't know their place. You plead guilty, you do your 6 months, you learn some humility, or you fight me and I bury you. This was the moment, the coercion. This was exactly what the FBI needed." Martin had been briefed on Ellington's tactics for months. The Bureau had received complaints from civil rights groups, from families of defendants, even from a whistleblower clerk who had since resigned. But they needed him on tape, explicitly coercing a plea with a threat of biased sentencing. "I didn't do it," Martin said firmly. Ellington slammed his hand on the desk. "I don't care if you did it or not. It's irrelevant. The system needs a conviction. Officer Higgins needs his arrest record to stay clean, and I need my docket cleared. You are a cog in the machine, Davies. You are nothing." Ellington stood up and walked around the desk, stopping inches from Martin. The judge was shorter, but he projected a toxic dominance. "Let me tell you a story," Ellington said, his eyes cold. 3 years ago, a boy named Tavern Little stood right where you are. He had an attitude too, refused a plea. I gave him 15 years. He hanged himself in his cell 2 months later. His mother cried in my court. You know what I did? I went to lunch. Don't be Taven, son. Take the plea. The reference to Taven Little sent a chill through Martin. That wasn't just a story. Tavon Little was the reason Martin had taken this assignment. Tavon was Martin's younger cousin. Martin had to fight every instinct in his body to keep from grabbing Ellington by the throat. He had to remain the professional agent. He had to get the job done. "I won't plead guilty," Martin said, his voice icy. Ellington's face turned purple. "Get him out of here," he roared at the bailiff. "Bail is revoked, remanded to custody until trial. I'll see you in court next week, and bring your toothbrush, Davies, because you're never going home." Officer Reynolds grabbed Martin's arm roughly. "Let's go." As Martin was shoved out of the chambers, he caught a glimpse of Poulsen. The lawyer looked sick. He knew what was coming. But Poulsen didn't know that the tiny button on Martin's hoodie was a high-fidelity 4K camera, and the wire running down his leg had just transmitted the entire conversation to a surveillance van parked 3 blocks away. Inside that van, Special Agent Sarah Miller adjusted her headset. Her face was grim. "Did you get that?" asked the technician beside her. "Every word," Miller said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "He just confessed to fixing cases and threatened a defendant with a maximum sentence for exercising his right to a trial, and he admitted to the Tavon Little railroading." "Do we move in?" the tech asked. "Not yet," Miller said, watching the screen where Martin was being led to a holding cell. "Ellington wants a show trial. We're going to give him one. He wants to destroy Martin in public? Fine. We're going to destroy him in front of the whole world." The Jefferson County Jail was a concrete box designed to strip a man of his dignity. Martin was processed with the general population, a necessary risk to maintain his cover. He was fingerprinted, stripped, showered, and dressed in an orange jumpsuit that smelled of mildew. As he sat in the holding cell, surrounded by men who looked defeated and angry, Martin closed his eyes and replayed the briefing. This wasn't just about Judge Ellington. It was about a corruption ring known as the Blue Line Club. Ellington, the district attorney, and several high-ranking police officers, including the sheriff, had been running a racket for a decade. They targeted minority communities, trumped up charges, and forced plea deals. Those plea deals fed bodies into the private prison system, which in turn kicked back consulting fees to a shell company owned by Ellington's wife. It was modern-day slavery, disguised as law and order. Martin remembered the day Tavon died. Tavon was 19. He was a good kid, a scholarship student who played the cello. He had been walking home from a rehearsal when he was stopped for fitting a description. When he asked why he was being arrested, he was beaten. Ellington had called him a thug in open court. Martin opened his eyes. He wasn't just an FBI agent today. He was the Avenger. Back in the FBI field office, the team was working around the clock. They needed to make the connection between Ellington and the private prison unequivocally clear before the trial. "We need the financial records," Agent Miller told the forensic accountant, David Chen. "We know Ellington is getting paid, but we need the paper trail linking the convictions to the deposits." "I'm close," Chen said, typing furiously. "Ellington is smart. He uses offshore accounts in the Caymans, but he made a mistake. He paid for his mistress's condo renovation directly from the shell company." "Got him," Miller whispered. "Okay, here is the plan. We let the trial start. We let Ellington hang himself on the record. We need him to double down on his bias in a public courtroom. Once he passes a verdict or makes a definitive ruling that violates Martin's rights, we execute the warrant." Back in the cell, a large man with tattoos covering his neck sat down next to Martin. "You the guy who talked back to Ellington?" the man asked. Martin nodded. "Yeah." The man shook his head. "You crazy man. He's gonna bury you. I seen him give a guy 10 years for possession of a joint. He calls himself the cleaner." "He's not going to bury me," Martin said quietly. "He's digging his own grave. He just doesn't know it yet." The next 3 days in jail were a test of endurance. Martin had to play the role of the terrified inmate while maintaining his mental edge. He saw the brutality of the guards, men who answered to the sheriff, who answered to Ellington. He saw inmates denied medical, inmates beaten for speaking too loudly. Every incident was catalogued in his memory. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread that someone had challenged Ellington. The local press was there, along with community activists. And in the back row, dressed in plain clothes, were 6 federal agents. Ellington entered the courtroom like a gladiator entering the arena. He looked energized. He looked ready to kill. "All rise," the bailiff shouted. Ellington sat and scanned the room. His eyes landed on Martin. He smiled, a cold, predatory grin. "State versus Davies," Ellington announced. "I see the defendant has refused our generous plea offer. Very well, we proceed to trial. Mr. Prosecutor, are you ready?" The prosecutor, a young, ambitious man named George Vance, another Ellington puppet, stood up. "Ready, Your Honor. The state intends to prove that Mr. Davies is a violent danger to society." "Let's get on with it," Ellington said. "And Mr. Poulsen, try not to waste my time." Martin sat at the defense table. Poulsen was shaking so hard, his pen was rattling against the table. "Don't worry, Andrew," Martin whispered to his lawyer. "Just sit back and watch." "Watch what?" Poulsen hissed. "You're going to prison." "No," Martin said, looking at the judge. "I'm going to work." The air in the courtroom was heavy, the humidity battling the struggling air conditioner. The jury, 12 people pulled from their daily lives, looked bored and uncomfortable. They already knew the script. A black man in an orange jumpsuit versus a white cop with a chest full of commendations. In Judge Ellington's court, the ending was written before the opening statements. Prosecutor Vance didn't waste time. "The state calls Officer Dennis Higgins." Higgins walked to the stand with a swagger. He was thick-necked, with a buzz cut and eyes that looked like 2 chips of flint. He didn't look at Martin. He looked at the jury, giving them a practiced, reassuring nod. Ellington beamed. "Officer Higgins, welcome. Swear him in." After the oath, Vance began his softball questioning. Higgins recited the fabricated narrative flawlessly. He claimed Martin had been swerving. He claimed when he approached the car, he smelled marijuana. He claimed Martin became belligerent, shouting anti-police rhetoric, and then shoved him violently when asked to step out of the vehicle. "I feared for my safety," Higgins said, his voice dropping an octave for dramatic effect. "I had to use necessary force to subdue the suspect." "Thank you, officer," Vance said, looking smug. "Your witness, Mr. Poulsen." Andrew Poulsen stood up, his papers shaking in his hands. He walked toward the podium like a man walking to the gallows. "Officer Higgins," Poulsen stammered. Did my client, did he actually hit you? Or was it more of a, shall we say, a brush?" Ellington groaned loudly. "Mr. Poulsen, stop wasting the court's time with semantics. Assault is assault. But Your Honor," Poulsen squeaked, "the degree of contact matters for the charge of aggravated." "Move on, Poulsen," Ellington barked. Poulsen withered. He asked 2 more meaningless questions about the time of day and the traffic conditions, then sat down, defeated. Ellington smirked. "Is that it? Pathetic. Redirect, Mr. Vance?" Martin had seen enough. He leaned over to Poulsen. "Sit down and shut up. I'm taking over." Poulsen looked terrified. "What? You can't. I'm your lawyer." "Not anymore," Martin said. He stood up. His tall frame seemed to fill the space between the defense table and the bench. "Your Honor," Martin's voice rang out, clear and commanding, shocking the jury who expected the usual mumble of a defeated defendant. "I petition the court to dismiss Mr. Poulsen as my counsel. He is ineffective and intimidated by this court. I wish to invoke my Sixth Amendment right to represent myself pro se." Silence slammed into the courtroom. A pro se defense was usually a disaster, the last desperate act of a crazy person. Ellington leaned back, a cruel smile spreading across his face. This was getting entertaining. The mouse wanted to fight the cat. "You want to represent yourself?" Ellington laughed. "Mr. Davies, you are a mechanic with a GED. You are facing 10 years. You have a fool for a client." "It is my constitutional right, Judge," Martin said, holding Ellington's gaze. "Unless you are denying me that right too?" Ellington bristled at the challenge. "Fine. Poulsen, your standby counsel. Sit in the back. Mr. Davies, step up. Let's see you play lawyer. But be warned, I will hold you to the same standards as a member of the bar. 1 toe out of line, and I hold you in contempt." Martin walked to the podium. He didn't look like a mechanic in an orange jumpsuit anymore. He looked like a predator stalking its prey. He picked up Officer Higgins's arrest report. "Officer Higgins," Martin began, his tone clinically detached. "You stated you smelled marijuana coming from my vehicle. Yet, no marijuana was found in the car, on my person, or in my bloodstream according to the toxicology report. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Higgins blinked. He wasn't used to defendants using words like discrepancy or toxicology. He looked at Vance for help, then at the judge. "I know what I smelled," Higgins grunted. "Maybe you tossed it before I got to the window." "You also testified that I was swerving," Martin continued, not missing a beat. "I have here the GPS data from my car's onboard computer for that night. It shows I maintained a perfect lane position for 5 miles prior to the stop, at exactly the speed limit. Are you lying to this jury, officer?" "Objection!" Vance jumped up. "Badgering the witness." "Sustained," Ellington snapped. "Watch it, Davies. Don't call a decorated officer a liar in my courtroom." "I'm merely presenting facts that contradict his sworn testimony, Your Honor," Martin said calmly. He turned back to Higgins. "Officer, your report says I shoved you with my right hand, yet in your body camera footage, which I finally received this morning after 3 requests, it shows my right hand was holding my registration documents the entire time. Would you like to watch the video with the jury to refresh your memory?" Higgins turned pale. He looked at Ellington, panic in his eyes. The fix was in, but nobody told him the defendant would have the actual evidence. Ellington slammed his gavel. "Enough of this. We are taking a recess. Jury, clear the room. Now!" As the jury shuffled out, confused, Ellington leaned over the bench, his face a mask of fury. Listen to me, you arrogant little punk, Ellington hissed at Martin, unaware the microphones were still hot, recording everything for the FBI van outside. You think you're clever? I run this town. You're going to rot in prison for making a fool of my officer. I'm going to bury you so deep they'll need a mining permit to find your bones. Martin just smiled. Is that a judicial ruling, Your Honor? Or another threat? The recess lasted an hour. When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed. The jury was no longer bored. They were electrified. They sensed something was deeply wrong. The dynamic had shifted. The man in the orange suit was in control, and the man in the black robe was terrified. Ellington tried to regain control by speeding things along. State rests, Vance murmured, looking defeated after Higgins's disastrous cross-examination. Defense! Call your first witness, Ellington barked, glaring at Martin. The defense calls Martin Davies, Martin announced. Another wave of shock. Defendants almost never took the stand, especially when they had a prior record, however minor. But Martin had no record. Martin walked to the witness stand, took the oath, and sat down. Since he was representing himself, he had to give a narrative statement. He looked directly at the jury. I am not going to tell you I'm a saint, but I am going to tell you what happened on July 14th, and what happened in Judge Ellington's chambers 3 days ago. Objection, Vance yelled. Relevance. What happened in chambers is privileged. Overruled, Ellington said, quickly, surprisingly. He thought this was his chance. If Martin talked, Ellington could cross-examine him. He could twist his words. Let him hang himself, Mr. Vance. Go ahead, Davies. Tell your fairy tale. Martin nodded. He started describing the arrest with clinical precision, highlighting every procedure Higgins violated. But then, he shifted. I was brought to this courthouse. I pleaded not guilty. Because I exercised that right, Judge Ellington dragged me into his private chambers. Ellington sat up straighter, his knuckles white on the gavel handle. He didn't have a court reporter present, Martin continued, his voice rising slightly, filling the room with a quiet intensity. He told me that if I didn't plead guilty to a crime I didn't commit, he would ensure I received the maximum sentence of 10 years. He told me that guilt or innocence was irrelevant. He said he needed to clear his docket. The jury gasped. A woman in the front row put her hand over her mouth. Ellington's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. You are lying under oath. I never said that. Martin turned in the witness chair to face the judge directly. It was unimaginable breach of decorum. Did you not also tell me about Taven Little? Martin asked. The name hung in the air like smoke. Ellington froze. The color drained from his face. Tavon Little, Martin repeated, his voice thick with emotion for the first time. 19 years old, the cello player. You told me you gave him 15 years because he had an attitude. You boasted that he hanged himself in his cell. You used a dead boy as a prop to threaten me into a plea deal. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones. The community activists in the back were shouting, "Shame!" Ellington slammed his gavel furiously, over and over, like a blacksmith hammering iron. Order. Order in this court. Bailiff, silence them. You are in contempt, Davies. You are done. Ellington was standing now, his robes swirling around him, a mad king losing his kingdom. I'll have you gagged, Ellington roared. I'll have you thrown in the deepest hole in the county jail. You think you can come into my court and slander me? I am the law. I decide what is truth in here. Martin sat perfectly still on the witness stand, letting Ellington scream, letting the jury see the monster behind the mask. The camera button on his jumpsuit was capturing every vein popping in Ellington's neck, every drop of spittle flying from his lips. Are you finished, Judge? Martin asked quietly, when Ellington finally paused for breath. Finished? Ellington spluttered. I'm just getting started with you. I am hereby revoking your right to self-representation. I am declaring a mistrial due to your flagrant misconduct, and I am holding you in criminal contempt with a summary sentence of 6 months to begin immediately. It was an illegal ruling, a hysterical overreach of judicial power. It was exactly what the FBI needed. The final nail. Martin calmly reached up to his collar. I don't think you have the authority to do that anymore, Lawrence, Martin said. He ripped the orange collar open, revealing a small, dark microphone taped to his chest. Ellington stared at the microphone, his brain unable to process what he was seeing. What is that? Martin stood up in the witness box. He didn't look at the judge. He looked toward the back doors of the courtroom. Special Agent Miller, Martin stated into the microphone, his voice booming through the hidden earpieces of the team outside. The subject has just committed felony deprivation of rights under color of law. On the record. Execute the warrant. The heavy double doors at the back of courtroom 4B burst open with a crash that sounded like a thunderclap. 6 FBI agents in full tactical gear, windbreakers emblazoned with bright yellow FBI letters, swarmed into the room. They moved with terrifying speed and precision. At the lead was Special Agent Sarah Miller, her face set in grim determination. The courtroom plunged into chaos. Jurors shrieked and scrambled under their chairs. Prosecutor Vance dropped his briefcase, spilling papers everywhere. The bailiff, Officer Reynolds, instinctively reached for his gun, saw the federal agent's carbines pointed at him, and wisely put his hands in the air. Ellington stood frozen on his elevated bench, a statue of disbelief. FBI, nobody move! Agent Miller shouted, her voice commanding total obedience. She marched straight down the center aisle, past the stunned spectators, past the defense table where Martin stood calmly, and up the steps to the bench. She stopped directly in front of Judge Ellington. The man who had towered over everyone in this county for 20 years now looked small, shriveled, and utterly pathetic. Lawrence Ellington, Agent Miller announced, holding up a federal arrest warrant. You are under arrest. Ellington's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled onto a dock. You can't be serious. Do you know who I am? This is my courtroom. Not anymore, Miller said. She stepped up onto the platform, invading his sacred space. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. This is an outrage, Ellington sputtered, looking toward his bailiff for help that wasn't coming. I'll have your badges. I'll call the governor. You can call whoever you want from your holding cell, Miller said. She spun him around roughly. The sound of ratcheting steel handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom, a sound Ellington had inflicted on thousands, now ringing in his own ears. Agent Miller leaned in close to his ear. You are charged with racketeering, bribery, wire fraud, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights. And we have everything: the offshore accounts, the kickbacks from the private prison, and about 50 hours of audio of you coercing defendants in your chambers. She pulled him toward the steps. He stumbled, his robes tangling around his legs. As they reached the floor level, Martin walked over. He stood face to face with the man who had threatened to bury him an hour ago. Ellington looked up at Martin, his eyes wide with betrayal. You're one of them? Martin reached into his pocket and pulled out his gold FBI shield. He held it up, letting the light catch it. Special Agent Martin Thorne, FBI Criminal Division, he said. His voice was hard, devoid of the fake humility he'd worn for weeks. Ellington looked sick. But why me? Martin leaned in, his voice a low growl that only Ellington could hear. For Taven Little, and for every other life you traded for a kickback. You wanted to clean the streets, Lawrence? We're starting with the biggest piece of trash in the county. Martin nodded to Miller. "Get him out of here." 2 agents grabbed Ellington by the arms and frog-marched him out of the courtroom. The same path hundreds of black men had taken in chains. The local press reporters were shoving their cameras in his face, blinding him with flashes, shouting questions he couldn't answer. The community activists were cheering, some openly weeping with relief. As Ellington was dragged through the courthouse lobby, he saw his portrait hanging on the wall. Judge Lawrence Ellington, pillar of justice. He knew, with sickening certainty, that by tomorrow morning it would be gone. Back in the courtroom, Martin stood alone in the center of the chaos. He looked at the jury box. The jurors were slowly emerging from under their seats, looking at him with awe and fear. Martin just nodded to them slowly. The show was over. The real trial, Ellington's trial, was just beginning. And Martin knew, with grim satisfaction, that Ellington wouldn't be getting a plea deal. The walk from courtroom 4B to the waiting FBI transport van was the longest 3 minutes of Lawrence Ellington's life. For 20 years he had walked these marble corridors as a god. Officers had saluted him, lawyers had bowed their heads, clerks had scrambled to open doors. Now the handcuffs bit into his wrists. Too tight, he noted with a grimace of pain, and the agents gripping his arms were not gentle. They treated him exactly as he had instructed his bailiffs to treat the thugs and drain-on society that usually stood before his bench. The lobby of the Jefferson County Courthouse was a chaotic sea of flashing lights. News had traveled with the speed of a digital wildfire. The local press, usually deferential to Ellington, had been replaced by hungry wolves from national networks. "Judge Ellington, did you take bribes from Secure Corp? Is it true you targeted minorities for profit? Judge, look this way. Show us the cuffs." The flashes were blinding, a strobe light of humiliation. Ellington tried to lower his head, to hide his face, but Agent Miller, walking on his left, murmured, "Head up, Lawrence. You wanted to be the face of justice in this county. Now you are." They shoved him into the back of an unmarked black SUV. The door slammed shut, cutting off the noise of the crowd, leaving him in a sudden, ringing silence. The air inside the car was stale. He looked out the tinted window and saw his reflection, disheveled hair, a twisted tie, and eyes wide with a terror he couldn't suppress. He was driven not to the local precinct, where he might have called in a favor, but to the federal field office 3 towns over. The processing was a slow, deliberate dismantling of his ego. "Name?" the booking officer asked, not looking up from his computer. "You know who I am," Ellington snapped, trying to summon a shred of his old authority. "I am Judge Lawrence Ellington." The officer looked up. He was a young black man, perhaps the same age as Taven Little would have been. He stared at Ellington with zero recognition, zero fear. "Name," the officer repeated, his voice flat. "Lawrence, Edward, Ellington," he whispered, defeated. They took his bespoke suit, the Italian silk tie, the gold watch that had been a gift from the sheriff. In return, they gave him a jumpsuit. It wasn't the clean, pressed orange he saw on TV. It was faded, rough against his skin, and smelled faintly of industrial detergent and old sweat. When he put it on, he felt the transformation complete. The judge was dead. The inmate was born. The unraveling of the Blue Line Club was not a slow leak. It was a dam breaking. While Ellington sat in a holding cell, staring at a stainless steel toilet, the FBI was executing simultaneous raids across the county. They hit the sheriff's office, seizing hard drives and logbooks. They hit the offices of Secure Corp, boxing up financial records that linked the prison occupancy rates directly to Ellington's sentencing patterns. But the hardest blow came 48 hours later, during his first meeting with his defense attorney, a high-powered shark named Gerald Fitzpatrick, who charged $800 an hour. Fitzpatrick walked into the visitation room, looking grim. He didn't sit down. He placed a folder on the metal table and sighed. "It's bad, Lawrence," Fitzpatrick said. "Get me bail," Ellington demanded, gripping the edge of the table. "I need to get out of here. I need to talk to my wife. She has access to the offshore accounts. We can mobilize funds for a defense." Fitzpatrick shook his head slowly. "You haven't heard?" "Heard what?" "Your wife, Eleanor. She was picked up by the feds yesterday morning. Conspiracy to commit money laundering." Ellington's blood ran cold. "Eleanor doesn't know anything. She just signed the papers I gave her." "The feds offered her a deal, Lawrence," Fitzpatrick said softly. "Full immunity if she flips on you." "She took it." Ellington felt the room spin. She testified?" "She gave them everything," Fitzpatrick confirmed. "The ledger book she kept in the safe, the passwords to the Cayman accounts, the dates of the meetings with the prison CEO at your lake house. She told them you were the architect of the whole scheme. She filed for divorce this morning, and the government has already frozen every single asset. The house, the cars, the accounts. You're broke, Lawrence." Ellington slumped back in his chair. Eleanor, his partner, the woman who had enjoyed the trips to Paris and the diamond necklaces bought with the blood money of innocent men. She had cut him loose to save her own skin. "So," Ellington whispered, his voice trembling, "what is the strategy?" "The strategy," Fitzpatrick said, closing his folder, "is to beg. The U.S. attorney isn't offering a plea deal. They want to make an example of you. They are going for the maximum on RICO charges. That's life without parole. We are going to trial, but I have to be honest with you. I don't see a way out. The months leading up to the trial were a torture of their own design. Because of his status as a former judge, Ellington was placed in administrative segregation, solitary confinement, for his own protection. The general population would have killed him within an hour. He spent 23 hours a day in a cell the size of a parking space. He had no window. He had no books. He had only his thoughts. He thought about the men he had sent to places like this. He thought about how he had mocked their tears. He realized with a creeping horror that he had no idea what prison was actually like. He had treated it as an abstract concept, a storage locker for humans. Now, he knew the smell. He knew the crushing boredom that felt like a physical weight. He knew the madness that scratched at the corners of your mind when the lights never fully turned off. He started talking to himself. He relitigated old cases in the empty air. He argued with ghosts. Then, the trial began. It was held in the Federal District Court, a sleek, modern building that lacked the old-world charm of Ellington's courthouse, but made up for it in intimidating efficiency. The courtroom was packed every single day. The prosecution's case was a masterclass in precision. Leading the charge was Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen, the forensic accountant who had tracked the money. But the star witness was Special Agent Martin Thorne. When Martin took the stand, he didn't wear a uniform. He wore a sharp navy suit. He looked every inch the federal agent. Ellington watched him from the defense table with a mixture of hatred and fear. This was the man he had called a thug. This was the man he had tried to crush. "Agent Thorne," the prosecutor asked, "can you explain to the jury the nature of your undercover operation?" "We had received credible intelligence that Judge Ellington was operating a kids for cash scheme," Martin said, his voice calm and projecting to the back of the room. "I inserted myself into the system as a defendant to test the judicial process. I wanted to see if the judge would follow the law when faced with a defendant who asserted his rights." "And did he?" "No," Martin said. "He violated my rights at every turn. He revoked bail without cause. He threatened me with maximum sentencing for requesting a trial, and he admitted, on tape, to his motivations. "Let's play the tape," the prosecutor said. This was the moment Ellington had dreaded. The courtroom darkened, and the audio recording from his chambers began to play. "You think you're smart. You think quoting the Eighth Amendment scares me. I am the law in this county." Ellington's voice boomed through the speakers, distorted but unmistakable. The arrogance was palpable. The jury, a diverse group of 12 citizens, looked at the defendant's table. They didn't see a judge, they saw a bully. Then came the part about Tavon Little. 3 years ago, a boy named Tavon Little stood right where you are. I gave him 15 years. He hanged himself. You know what I did? I went to lunch. A gasp went through the gallery. In the front row, Tavon Little's mother, a small woman with grey hair, buried her face in a handkerchief and sobbed quietly. Martin, still on the stand, looked directly at her, his expression softening. Then he looked at Ellington, and his eyes hardened into steel. Ellington couldn't look up. He stared at his hands. He wanted to scream that it was taken out of context, that he was just trying to scare the kid straight, but he knew nobody would believe him. The malice in his voice was undeniable. The defense had nothing. Fitzpatrick tried to cross-examine Martin, tried to suggest entrapment, but Martin was too sharp. He parried every question, turning the focus back on Ellington's choices. "I didn't force the defendant to take the bribe," Martin said smoothly. "I didn't force him to threaten me. I didn't force him to mock a dead teenager. Those were his choices. I just provided the microphone." The closing arguments were devastating. The prosecutor pointed to Ellington and said, "This man sold the liberty of American citizens for $2,000 a head. He turned the Hall of Justice into a marketplace of misery. If the law applies to anyone, it must apply to him." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood up. He didn't look at Ellington. "On count 1, racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. On count 2, wire fraud, guilty. On count 3, deprivation of rights, guilty." It went on and on, 42 counts, 42 guilty verdicts. Each one felt like a physical blow to Ellington's chest. He felt like he couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. Sentencing day was the final act of the tragedy. The courtroom was overflowing. People were standing in the back. The press gallery was full. Judge Elena Rodriguez presided. She was known as the Iron Lady of the Federal Circuit. She had read the pre-sentencing report. She had read the letters from the hundreds of victims Ellington had wrongfully imprisoned. She asked Ellington if he had anything to say. Ellington stood up. He looked old. His hair, once silver and slick, was now white and thinning. He had lost 30 pounds. "Your Honor," he rasped, I served this county for 20 years. I made the streets safe. I made a mistake, yes, but I am not a monster." Judge Rodriguez stared at him over her spectacles. The silence stretched for an eternity. "Mr. Ellington," she began, her voice low and dangerous, "you are not a monster. Monsters are myths. You are something far worse. You are a corrupt man who believed he was a god." She picked up a stack of letters. "I have here statements from 112 families, mothers who lost sons, children who grew up without fathers, men who lost their jobs, their homes, and their dignity because you wanted to renovate your vacation home. You spoke of making the streets safe, but you were the greatest danger to this community." She leaned forward. "You sentenced Tavon Little to 15 years for a non-violent offense, a sentence that effectively ended his life. Today I am going to show you the mercy you denied him, which is to say, I will show you none." Please, Ellington whimpered. Lawrence Ellington, I sentence you to 360 months, 30 years in federal prison. Given your age of 62, this is effectively a life sentence. You will not be eligible for parole. You will die in custody. The gavel came down. Bang! It was the loudest sound Ellington had ever heard. It sounded like the door of a tomb slamming shut. Remand the prisoner, Judge Rodriguez ordered. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped forward. They didn't wait for him to move. They grabbed him by the elbows and hauled him up. As they dragged him out, Ellington looked back at the gallery one last time. He saw the faces of the people he had hurt. They weren't cheering. They were watching with a solemn, heavy satisfaction. And there, standing by the aisle, was Martin Thorne. Martin didn't smile. He simply nodded, a gesture of finality. Ellington was led through the side door into the darkness of the holding tunnel and out of the free world forever. 6 months later, the Jefferson County Courthouse looked different. The creeping ivy had been trimmed, the steps power-washed. But the biggest change was the bronze plaque by the front entrance. The old dedication to Lawrence Ellington had been pried off, leaving scars in the stone that had been filled and polished. In its place stood a new sign, the Tavon Little Justice Center, dedicated to the pursuit of fair and equal justice for all. Martin Thorne stood in front of the plaque, his hands in his pockets. The autumn wind swirled leaves around his feet. He wasn't undercover anymore. He was wearing his badge on his belt, visible to the world. Next to him stood Andrew Polson. The nervous, sweating public defender had changed too. After the trial, emboldened by Martin's intervention, Polson had quit the public defender's office and started a non-profit legal clinic dedicated to overturning Ellington's wrongful convictions. He looked tired, but he stood straighter. "We got another 3 out today," Polson said, watching the doors. The review board overturned the drug charges. They're going home to their families. "Good work, Andrew," Martin said. "It's going to take years to clean up the mess he made." Polson sighed. "We're still finding cases from 2015 that smell rotten." "We have time," Martin said. "Justice is a marathon, not a sprint." "Did you hear about Ellington?" Polson asked. Martin nodded. "I heard. Ellington was currently housed in a maximum security federal penitentiary in Colorado. Reports said he was working in the prison laundry, folding sheets for 12 cents an hour. He had stopped filing appeals. He spent his recreation time staring at the snowy mountains in the distance, mountains he would never climb. He had become exactly what he hated, a statistic, a number in a system. "He's getting the life he earned," Martin said. "And you?" Polson asked. "What's next for the FBI's star witness?" "I'm moving on," Martin said. "There's a corruption case in Chicago, another judge, another kickback scheme. It seems Ellington wasn't the only one." Polson extended his hand. "Well, on behalf of everyone in this county. Thank you. You saved us." Martin shook the hand firmly. "The truth saved you, Andrew. I just held the light." Martin walked away from the courthouse, heading toward his car. He drove out of the city, past the rows of houses, past the shops, and turned onto the quiet road leading to the cemetery. He parked and walked to the oak tree. The grass was green and well-tended. He knelt by Tavon's grave. "Hey, kid," Martin whispered. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a copy of the official court order renaming the building. He tucked it under a small rock on the headstone. "I know it doesn't bring you back," Martin said, his voice choking up slightly. "Nothing can do that. But nobody is going to forget your name now. Every time a judge walks into that building, they're going to see your name. They're going to remember what happens when they abuse their power." A bird chirped in the branches above. a bright, clear sound that cut through the heavy air. Martin stood up. He wiped his eyes and looked at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the graveyard. The world was imperfect. There were still bad men in power. There were still fights to be fought. But tonight, in Jefferson County, the monsters were in cages, and the innocent were going home. Martin got into his car, started the engine, and drove toward the sunset, ready for the next fight. And that is the story of how one brave agent took down a corrupt empire. It's a harsh reminder that power doesn't make you immune to justice. It just makes the fall that much harder. Judge Ellington thought he was untouchable, but he forgot the most important rule of the courtroom. The truth always finds a way out. What do you think about the sentence? Did 35 years fit the crime, or should he have gotten more for the lives he ruined? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We have a terrifying medical thriller coming up next week that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.